Hey friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and it is now September. That means our August Food Preservation Challenge, the Every Bit Counts Challenge, has come to an end. And this is going to be the final video in the 2024 Every Bit Counts Challenge series. So it has been a wonderful month. I have felt like I've got a lot accomplished by doing these little canning projects every day. If you're new to the channel or to the challenge, the Every Bit Counts Challenge is a food preservation challenge that we do here on YouTube and on Instagram every August. The goal of it is to preserve something every single day, no matter how small. And the point is that if you do a little bit every day, every bit counts and adds up to a big and stocked pantry by the end of the month. And so in this video, I'm going to show you the projects that we did here on the last week of the challenge, and then at the end we'll come together and talk about where we're going to go from here. I started the week off with a rather simple project here. I just had extra zucchini that I knew we weren't going to eat fresh this week, so I got out my Veggie Spiralizer, and I'll link this in the video description for you. This is a really old one, like 15-year-old Veggie Spiralizer. It gets the job done though. And I'm going to start by taking my zucchini and running it through this. This basically makes what is called zucchini noodles or zoodles. And this is a really fast way to shred up my zucchini. Once I get the long noodle strips, I just take some scissors and cut them up into tiny pieces. I want to freeze this zucchini to use for future baking projects in the winter. So I'm going to get out my recipes and just check. I have a zucchini pie that Adam really loves that I'd like to freeze this zucchini for, as well as a zucchini bread recipe. So just looking for quantities to see what makes the most sense to freeze these in terms of portions. And I thought 2 cups would be perfect. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do. Now, I know I talk a lot about when you freeze vegetables that it's really important to blanch them first. Blanching does preserve the nutrients in the vegetable and makes it so that they don't begin losing nutrition for until about 12 months after freezing. Unblanched vegetables are going to lose their nutrients much faster. After 3 months, they're going to need to start being used or they're going to start losing nutrition. Since I'm saving this zucchini for baking projects, I'm not worrying about blanching. There are some vegetables, zucchini being one of them, green peppers are another one that I don't blanch simply because the texture gets worse with blanching than if I were to leave it alone. So this zucchini would just kind of turn to mush if I blanched it, and that isn't what I want. So this is one of the few vegetables that I'm going to show you that I don't blanch before freezing. But something that I do to preserve the texture is vacuum sealing all of that. And when we're done, we had 5 little bags. That'll make me 5 zucchini pies or whatever else I want to make with them this year. And we're going to get those tucked away in the freezer. So just didn't want to waste that zucchini. All gardeners have extra zucchini, and that's a great way to use it up. The next project this week was dealing with green beans. Now, I'm going to start by snapping green beans, and I get questions about why you do this. There are some people that don't snap their green beans. It is recommended that you snap off the stem end, but also the blossom end of green beans. There are lots of enzymes that collect at the blossom end of your green bean, and those enzymes can speed up the rate of, I guess, degradation of the bean. And so the best way to preserve the nutrition in the beans is to snap off both ends. That's what is recommended for canning and preserving methods. If you're just cooking these fresh, you can skip snapping them if you want to, but whenever I preserve them, this is a step that I do not skip. So now that I got this first batch of green beans all snapped, that was the hardest part. Now comes the easy part. We're just going to get these jars filled. I have one child that likes canned green beans more than he likes steamed or even fresh green beans. So I'm going to can a small batch for him. The rest of our green beans this year are going to be blanched and frozen. So I'm just packing my jars here. I really do prefer to use wide mouth jars when I'm doing green beans because it's really easy to get your hand in there and pack those green beans in there rather tightly. And then we're just doing a raw pack method. So I'm going to pour my water over the green beans to fill up the jars, leaving an inch headspace. Just going to give those jars a little jiggle to release any of the air bubbles, and I will just take a chopstick just to make sure there's no trapped air in there. This is called debubbling, and if there are any little air bubbles trapped in there that come to the surface, it's going to affect your water line, so you might just need to readjust a little bit, add more water to maintain that 1-inch headspace. And after you're done, you can get your lids on these jars. We are using 4 jars canning lids. As you guys know, these are my absolute favorite ones. These are the only lids that I use. You can get 10% off your canning lids using my code and the link in the video description. So once we got our lids on, we are going to get our rings on and put these in the pressure canner for 25 minutes. And when we're done, my son Gabriel has his favorite green beans here. These are the ones that he loves. Now for the rest of us that prefer like a firmer texture green bean, we're going to get busy working on blanching and freezing. So I hired some help. I had some little boys that needed something to do to keep them busy. So they decided to help me blanch some beans. And then we ended up deciding to employ a few more children to get it done a little faster. So everybody worked really hard to help me, and then they got to play really hard. We got out the sprinkler. It was really hot on this day afterwards. After they did all this work for me, they got to go play outside in the sprinkler. Now, all of those snapped ends will not be wasted. Those will be fed to the animals. The chickens absolutely love them. So once we snapped our beans, we are going to blanch our green beans. That just means we're going to boil them for about 3 minutes and then take them immediately out of the boiling water, shock them with ice cold water, and then let them completely dry before we package them up. As I mentioned before, blanching your vegetables before freezing will just preserve the nutrients longer. These will last for 12 months in the freezer before we start to see any of the nutrients begin to degrade. So just like with the zucchini, I'm going to be vacuum sealing these. It is really important that you let all of the moisture dry out of those green beans before you put them in your vacuum sealer. Some vacuum sealers are notorious for not sealing well when there's a lot of moisture in the bags. The vacuum sealer pulls the moisture out and it gets it up at the line where it's heat sealing. And those bags are notorious for coming unsealed in the freezer. So that is a little tip for you. Just make sure that you get your green beans as dry as possible. I just leave them on the counter on that towel for about 10 minutes and let them fully dry. Let the towel absorb some of that water before we run them through the vacuum sealer here. And here we go. We got about 7 or 8 meals worth of green beans here for the rest of the family. So I'm just happy to get one little batch of green beans preserved. The rest of our beans are still growing out in the garden. We're enjoying all those fresh, and we'll see if we have some more extras that we can preserve later on in the growing season. I'm just going to toss those in the freezer and get moving on to our next big project for the week, which was tomatoes. There are some years where I don't have to buy any tomatoes. I grow enough for all of my needs, and there are some years like this year where my tomato harvest is pitiful because I had morning sickness early on in the gardening season and just neglected my garden. So my tomatoes are not doing well. So we purchased 4 bushels of Roma tomatoes, and we're going to get busy making sauce. So the easy way that I do this is fill my roaster up, my electric roaster, with the tomatoes. The tops have been chopped off of these, and I cut out any bad spots. Just add a little bit of water to the bottom of that roaster to prevent any of these tomatoes from sticking or burning. And I just leave it on low, very low, like no higher than 200 degrees overnight. And it just softens those tomatoes up enough so that I can run them through my mill here to remove all of the seeds and the skins. Now, there are a lot of different mill options that you can use. There are really fancy electric ones. This is an old-fashioned, this was handed down to me from one of my 80-year-old friends who used to do a lot of apple canning. It's one of my favorite tools. I'm a creature of habit, so I haven't invested in an electric one because this gets the job done. I love this antique mill. It's great for things like tomatoes and doing applesauce. So we're just going to push down all the tomatoes. All of the meat, the pulp from the tomatoes goes through, and all of those seeds and skins get left behind. Now those skins, you can dry them, either freeze drying or dehydrating to make a tomato powder, or you can just go ahead and feed them to your animals. They'll love that too. And then all of the sauce that's left behind is going to get cooked down on the stove to the desired thickness. Now, when you are water bath canning or even pressure canning tomatoes, it is recommended that you add some extra acid. I'm doing citric acid. I add a half a teaspoon to each of my quart jars. If you're doing pint jars, it would be a quarter of a teaspoon of citric acid. And then we just fill the jars the rest of the way with our sauce. If you don't want to use citric acid and you prefer to use lemon juice, you would put 2 tablespoons per quart jar for your extra acid. Then we're just going to wipe the rims of those jars. We're going to add our lids, and I am choosing to water bath can my sauce. I just find it to be a little bit easier, takes a little less time. You don't have to bring the pressure canner up to pressure and bring it back down. And actually like the taste better of the water bathed tomato sauce versus pressure canned. So this is going to go in the water bath for 40 minutes for quart jars. It would be 35 minutes for pints. And so I like to can my sauce plain. You'd notice that I didn't put any other seasonings in it to make it like a pasta sauce, and that is just purely because I like this to be a little more versatile. I'll use these jars of tomato sauce for other things too, like sometimes we make like a taco soup, or even sometimes for chili. If I'm out of tomato juice, I'll use the tomato sauce. And so I don't want to have those Italian pasta seasonings in my jars. So we were very busy with tomatoes, as you can imagine, with 4 bushels. That kept me very busy this week. Just for reference, 1 bushel of tomatoes is between 50 to 53 pounds. And from that, you can usually get 18 quarts of tomato sauce. So that can help you with your calculations if you were going to purchase or grow tomatoes for canning purposes. Now, how much sauce you get is definitely dependent on the variety of tomato that you're growing. These are Romas. They're known for being great for sauce because they're very meaty, they're not watery, they don't have a lot of seeds, so they do not take a whole lot of time to cook down. You're getting a lot of tomato meat in there, versus if you were going to can slicer tomatoes that are a lot more watery, have a lot more seeds in them, and try to cook those down, you're going to get a lot less sauce from the same number of tomatoes, if that makes sense. So from 4 bushels of tomatoes, we're able to get about 75 jars of tomato sauce, which is a huge blessing. My goal for the year is about 100 for my family. And we had lots of wonderful tomato tops that the animals absolutely enjoyed. That's a great thing about having something like chickens, or I know a lot of people have pigs that'll eat anything, but chickens are like pigs too. Pretty much anything we put out there, they're going to peck around at and eat and turn into protein for us. So they're happy when I do big canning projects like this and they get to eat all of the extras. So lots of jars on the counter. I did 1 little batch of tomato paste. I wanted to try canning up my own this year and just wanted to show you the process for that. So the process is exactly the same for making tomato paste as it is for making sauce, except you're just going to cook it down further. The other big difference is that you're going to add your citric acid to the pot while the sauce is cooking instead of adding it to the individual jars. If you put it in the bottom of the jars, your tomato paste is going to be so thick that that acid isn't going to be properly dispersed throughout the contents of the jar. Putting it in the pot and stirring it around will ensure that those jars are acidic enough to be safely canned. So you can see how thick we're getting this. We want this to be an actual tomato paste. So it took quite a while on the stove to cook down. And just like with our sauce, we're just going to fill the jars. We're going to get the rims of those jars all cleaned up. We're going to put on our lids and our rings, and then we are going to water bath can these little half pints for 45 minutes. Yes, it does take quite a long time. It's because the contents are so dense that it does take a really long time. It takes the full 45 minutes to ensure that the middle of those jars gets hot enough to prevent any botulism growth. These jars will be used for pizzas. 1 little half pint here will help us on pizza meal nights. I just add a couple flavorings and seasonings, and we like a really thick pizza sauce, so that's what we will use these for. But now sometimes you just want a couple tablespoons of tomato paste for certain recipes, and so I thought I would get out my Super Cube silicone trays here and fill them up with some of this leftover tomato paste to freeze. And so that'll be really convenient. What happens when you put them in silicone trays like this is that you put them in the freezer for about, 12 hours, 24 hours. Next day you can go in and pop those little cubes of whatever you've frozen right out of the trays and then put them in a big gallon freezer bag or however other way you would want to store them. And then when a recipe calls for a tablespoon or two, you can just throw one of those into the pot. So it's another really convenient way to preserve your tomato paste if you don't necessarily want to go to the trouble of canning it. My final project for this week, I decided to do one little batch of apple pie filling. So when I went through my cellar this week to kind of look at where I was at, I decided I was low on pie filling. I didn't do any peach pie filling this year or blueberry pie filling, and I had some extra apples in the house, so I thought, you know what, let's just do one 7-quart batch. So I'm going to show you the really easy way that I make my pie filling. I run those apples through that same slicer that I used for the zucchini. It just has another setting that makes these really thin strips like this. And I can get all of the apples for 7 quarts of apple pie filling sliced up in, I want to say it took me 10 minutes versus if I were slicing them by hand, it would take a whole lot longer. So this is just a really easy way to do it. The one thing you do have to watch is that you have to pick out any of those seeds that end up there. And then you end up with these little mushroom looking apple ends, and my little boys that were out in the sprinkler wanted those for snacks. So there was no waste here. Now we need to make the actual goo for our apple pie filling. I started out with 4.5 cups of sugar, and now we're going to add 9.5 cups of water. I'm going to link this recipe for you in the video description. I got this from a friend. This is not my recipe, so I want to give her credit. And then I'm going to add 1 cup of arrowroot powder. Well, her recipe actually calls for clear gel or cornstarch. I prefer to use arrowroot powder in mine. Next, we're going to add our spices. I'm going to do 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. Next, we're going to add 1 teaspoon of nutmeg. Then we're just going to do a 1/2 teaspoon of allspice and then 1 teaspoon of salt. Once we have all of those ingredients in our pot, we can get that all stirred up and get it on the stove. We want to bring it to a boil to help it thicken, but you do want to make sure you stir the bottom of that, or that sugar or that thickener can sometimes stick to the bottom and burn. So bring it to a boil, stir it until it gets nice and thick. I like to call it goopy. This is our pie goop. And so there are a lot of different ways to do that. Some people put their cut apples into the goop and then fill their jars with all of the contents. I like to just leave my apples in the jars and pour the goop over the top. It just saves me a step, and it's much easier in measuring out your apples when you do it this way. But I do end up having to really work that goop in there with a chopstick to make sure it fills in all of the spaces around the apples. I just kind of work it around, shake it, use that chopstick. I want to leave 1-inch headspace on these jars. And then that is really sticky goo, so we want to really make sure we wipe that before we get our lids and our rings on the jars. And then we're going to water bath can these for 25 minutes. These are so nice to have in the winter. Just make a quick and easy pie. I can just roll out a pie crust in 10 minutes, dump a jar into the crust, and I have a homemade pie in just a fraction of the time it would make me to make it completely from scratch. So that is what we were able to accomplish this week. I'm getting everything all put away that I worked on this week on the shelves, and that is the end of the challenge. It's so exciting. Look at all of these jars that we got done. I'm just really excited about the work that I accomplished over the course of the month of August. Okay, friends, that feels really good. I just got the last jar put away on my shelves here from this week's projects, and I also spent a little time this week kind of rearranging and reorganizing my cellar just to see where I'm at the end of the month of August. And I'm feeling pretty well stocked. I have some holes in some areas, but just because the month of August is over, it doesn't mean the food preservation season has ended. I still have several projects that are planned. We haven't butchered chickens yet, and all of that canning needs to be done. I'll be doing some more chicken soup and just canned chicken meat, also some broth. I have a little more pie filling I want to do after the apple harvest this fall. Just several projects like that will help fill in some gaps. But overall, I'm feeling really well prepared going into the winter from all of the work that we accomplished this month. I hope you guys had a wonderful month of food preservation. I hope you enjoyed watching all of the videos on the hashtag. The great thing is, if it's in the middle of winter and you're starting to prepare next year's garden and you want to think about the foods that you want to preserve, it's great motivation and inspiration to just check out that hashtag in the middle of winter and get ideas. And it helps you plan what you want to grow this year so that you have those crops available for the preservation projects that people are doing. So check out that hashtag. Thank you to all of the other accounts that participated this year. It's been a really fun year. I've enjoyed watching all of the content here on YouTube and on Instagram. This is always just a wonderful community, and I'm so grateful to all of you. So, I guess for me, now that August is over, like I said, food preservation doesn't end, but it definitely does start to take a back seat. We start back to school here in a couple days, and that now becomes my full-time job and #1 priority. So any preservation projects that I'm going to do are just going to be fit into evenings and weekends, little pockets of time that I might have maybe during nap time, but the bulk of my work is done. And now that I'm feeling well prepared, the next step will be to take you guys on a little pantry tour. So that's what I'll be bringing you next week. Make sure you check that out. We're going to tour all of my canning shelves. There's more behind me over here, over on that wall. We'll go through the freezers and show you all of the fruits and veggies and meats and things that we've got stored away. We've got freeze-dried goodies over here, lots of things like that. So we're going to do a full tour. I love to do that every year, and you guys seem to enjoy those videos, so this will be no different. So, all right, guys. Alright, I'm very excited. Thank you all for coming along on this Every Bit Counts Challenge journey with me for 2024. We will see you next week. Hope you have a great week, friends. Bye.